Each summer, the fair returns to the Tennessee mountains like an old promise. It's not noisy, not ostentatious, just enough to remind people that life here goes on. Late one afternoon in 1997, dusty red pickup trucks slowly rolled onto the gravel driveway. Children ran ahead of their parents, their hands sticky with cotton candy, their mouths smiling for no reason. Adults lingered, chatting and asking each other familiar questions. How was business this season? How were their families? The smell of frying oil permeated the air, mingling with the scent of dry grass and the music emanating from the makeshift stage. The fair lights weren't too bright, but warm enough to dispel the sense of isolation that the mountains often brought. For a few short hours, people emerged from the winding roads and houses nestled deep in the valley. They met here, as they had for years, believing it to be the safest place to laugh and talk, to forget their daily worries. No one came to the fair thinking that tonight would be the last night of anything. No one looked around to remember every face, every step, every wave. Those moments passed so lightly, so gently that their value was only realized when everything was gone. And in the peaceful light of that year's fair, 4 people walked through the crowd, unaware that they were very close to the boundary between an ordinary night and a story that would haunt the mountains for decades to come. Daniel Harper was driving that evening, as he usually did on most of the family's trips. 24, Daniel wasn't a man of many words, but he was always the one at the front. In these mountains, maturity wasn't measured by words, but by who was willing to take responsibility when something happened. Daniel had the air of someone accustomed to shouldering burdens from an early age. He locked the car carefully, remembering his father's habits, and rarely let anyone else worry about him. Luke Harper, 22, sat next to Daniel, taller, thinner, and quieter. Luke had just left vocational school. His hands still smelled of metal and machine oil. He wasn't the attention seeker. At family gatherings, Luke was usually the one listening, nodding more than speaking, but when needed, he was always there. Luke's silence wasn't a void, but a stability, something that reassured those around him without needing explanation. Ethan Harper sat in the back, 20 years old, restless, just like his youth. Ethan didn't know exactly where the road ahead would lead. He changed jobs, changed his mind, changed his dreams faster than others, but Ethan had one thing that remained constant: the way he smiled and the way he made everything lighter. In his family, Ethan was the one who broke the tension, the one who transformed difficult days into more bearable ones with just a few casual remarks. Emily Harper, 18, sat next to Ethan. A recent high school graduate, Emily stood on the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. In this mountainous region, that boundary was established earlier than elsewhere. Emily was accustomed to expectations, accustomed to being strong. She disliked being seen as the youngest, disliked being overly protective. Emily had a direct gaze, a look both curious and cautious, as if she always knew the world was much larger than the winding paths she had grown up on. They weren't just cousins, they were each other's childhood. Growing up together in nearby valleys, attending funerals and weddings together, sharing evenings when the power went out, with only candlelight and the sounds of insects. Here, friends might come and go, but family doesn't. For them, going to the fair wasn't a special trip. It was just an ordinary night, where 4 people stepped out of their familiar lives, carrying small, ordinary dreams and the belief that they would return home before dawn. Inside the fair, time seemed to slow down. Music from the stage mingled with the metallic sounds of the spinning rides, creating a familiar symphony that anyone who grew up in this mountainous region would have heard. Children tugged at adults' arms, asking for more cotton candy. Couples leaned against the fences, sipping soft drinks and talking about the harvest and the weather. Everything unfolded exactly as it did every year. The 4 siblings walked through the crowd, unhurried. They stopped at the funnel cake stall first, as was their habit. Hot batter, powdered sugar, dripping onto their sleeves, hair, and even their laughter. Daniel paid. Luke took the plate, and Ethan ate while teasing the vendor. Emily laughed, shook her head, and brushed the sugar off Ethan's shirt. These small gestures were not recorded, but they were the true memories of that night. They stopped near the giant Ferris wheel, where the lights reflected off each person's face in different ways. Someone raised a camera. A quick click. No one thought much about the picture, just another photo of the fair like in previous years. Around them, the crowd continued to move, still laughing and talking, still living in the present moment. Then they all parted ways briefly. Daniel met an acquaintance from the logging crew and exchanged a few pleasantries. Luke spotted an old friend near the livestock display, nodded in greeting, and shared a few short words. Emily paused in front of a handcrafted jewelry stall, her fingers lightly touching the simple silver rings, as if trying to imagine some kind of future for herself. Ethan disappeared towards the games area, determined to bring back a cheap gift that would make the whole group burst into laughter. Those moments were fleeting, too fleeting for anyone to think they were memorable. No one lingered to record every step, every glance. The fair remained noisy, brightly lit, and exuded the aura of a safe place. And amidst that ordinariness, there was no sign that tonight these very ordinary moments were quietly becoming their last. As the clock approached 9 o'clock in the evening, the fair entered its most boisterous moment. The music grew louder, the wheels sped up, laughter mingled with the clanging of metal. But on the edge of that brightly lit area, where the light began to fade and shadows crept in from the woods, there were things that didn't belong in the midst of the commotion. A volunteer who was on parking duty later recalled seeing the four brothers standing near the fence. They weren't exactly leaving, nor were they really returning. Daniel stood slightly apart, his shoulders more tense than before. Luke leaned toward him, listening. Ethan was unusually quiet. Emily crossed her arms, her eyes no longer searching for the game or the lights. A few steps away from them were two strangers. No one in the area recognized them. One wore a dark coat, even though it wasn't cold that night. The other stood slightly to the side of the path leading outside, his eyes constantly glancing towards the row of trees. Their conversation was quick and low-pitched. It wasn't a loud argument, but rather a kind of talk that sent shivers down the listener's spine, even though they couldn't hear every word clearly. The volunteer only heard a few fragmented pieces. A name was mentioned, a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any joy. Then, silence. Such things were not uncommon at the fair. Strangers came and went. Drunkards spoke without restraint. He turned away when a car parked improperly, needed to be reminded to move. That moment passed as quickly as any other. But with Emily, something seemed to have changed. A vendor near the maintenance area recalled the young woman taking half a step back. Not much, but enough to be noticeable. Not obvious fear, but a very instinctive wariness. Daniel raised his hand, a small but decisive gesture, as if to end the conversation. Luke looked around, for the first time that night, his eyes searching the edges of the fairgrounds, both light and shadow. No one called security. No one thought to alert anyone. Everything unfolded within the bounds of normalcy. But it was there, amidst the music and lights, that a feeling of unease emerged. Very subtle, very fleeting, and enough to make people later, looking back, wonder why no one stopped a little longer. Why no one kept them in that familiar light for a while. They left the crowded area, while the fairgrounds still echoed behind them. No one ran, no one hurried. The four walked close together, a long-standing habit. The path they chose wasn't marked for pedestrians. It ran along the maintenance area, past low warehouses, where the lights faded and the music became only a distant echo. Daniel walked ahead, his eyes fixed on the parking lot. He mumbled something about taking this route to avoid the traffic and get home faster. Luke followed closely behind, silent but attentive to every movement around him. Ethan slowed down a half-step, turning his head to look towards the dazzling lights of the fair, as if still clinging to something left unfinished. Emily was the last to walk. Her shadow stretched long across the uneven gravelly ground, then shortened as the lights behind her were obscured. The service road wasn't completely dark. It was just bright enough to prevent tripping, but not bright enough to feel safe. On either side were rows of dense trees, their trunks standing tall and silent. A gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and engine oil from the maintenance area. Here, voices sounded different. Each small word seemed to be swallowed up by the silence. A shopkeeper later recalled seeing them pass this section. She remembered Emily most clearly. The young woman turned her head once, very quickly, as if searching for a particular face in the distant crowd. Daniel raised his hand, a familiar gesture, indicating that everything was all right, that they were just leaving a little early. Emily said nothing. She turned back and continued walking, just a few dozen meters to the parking lot. But at that moment, the fairground lights were behind them. Ahead lay a narrow, silent path, leading deeper into the darkness of the mountains and forests. No one knew that this wasn't just the road to the waiting pickup truck, but the final boundary between an ordinary night and a disappearance without a trace. By midnight, the fair was gradually fading away. The music stopped. The stalls pulled down their awnings. Children dozed off on their parents' shoulders. The parking lot, which had been packed just hours before, now had only a few scattered cars under the dim yellow lights. Among them was a familiar pickup truck, parked at the edge of the lot, near the row of trees, exactly where Daniel had chosen earlier in the evening. The car was still there when the fair gates closed, still there when the cleaners collected the trash, and still there as dawn approached. The doors were locked. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, nothing to suggest anyone had returned and then quickly left. Everything was unusually neat. The next morning, when their relatives returned looking for the car, the first thing that turned their worry into fear. Daniel was careful. He never left his car overnight without telling anyone. Luke wasn't the type to change plans without notice. Ethan might be impulsive, but not to the point of abandoning everything. Emily never failed to call home before coming home. These four people could do many different things, but they couldn't possibly make the same decision in silence. The deputy officers arrived at the scene while the sun was still low. They walked around the car, bending down to examine the ground. No clear footprints, no drag marks, no belongings left behind. It was as if four people had come here, touched the edge of the parking lot, and then vanished without a trace for the outside world to see. For those who remained, the car was no longer a means of transportation. It became a static question. If they intended to leave, the car would have to have moved. If something had happened to them, something would have to have been disturbed. But nothing, that silence, that integrity, began to sow a very different kind of fear. Not the fear of getting lost, but the fear that someone had intervened, very quickly, very discreetly, and without leaving a trace to follow. On the first morning after the fair, hope was still close enough for people to cling to. No one spoke of the worst. All assumptions were made in the more favorable direction. Maybe they took the wrong path. Maybe they turned into the forest to avoid the noise. Maybe they decided to stay somewhere overnight and return in the morning. Getting lost wasn't uncommon in these mountains. People were used to nature testing them and then returning them unscathed. The deputy police officers set up a meeting point near the fairgrounds. Folding tables were unfolded and maps were laid flat in the early morning sun. Coffee cups were placed to hold the corners of the paper down and prevent them from flying away. The first circles were drawn around the car's location. They searched nearby first, then further away. Everything proceeded in a familiar, orderly, and calm manner, as if the answer would naturally appear given enough people and enough time. The volunteer rescue team arrived first. They were familiar with the terrain, the scent of the forest, and the silence. Service dogs were led along the trail. They dragged the leash, their noses close to the ground, but around the fairgrounds, the tracks had been erased by hundreds of footsteps from the night before. The scents overlapped, creating such a confusing mix that clear directions were impossible. They changed direction, tried again, and then returned to the starting point. The search teams fanned out along the hillside, down the dry streams, and along old, long-disused mining trails. These paths looked straightforward on the map, but in reality, they disappeared into the bushes, hidden by fallen trees and rocks. The mountain said nothing. It just stood there, as if unaware of the four people who had just passed by. The family stood waiting at the edge of the search area. Initially, they didn't ask many questions. They believed. They believed in the experience of the rescue team. They believed in their children's resilience. They believed that with just one more search, a few more hours, everything would be explained. That hope wasn't noisy. It was quiet, trying to keep the fear from taking shape. But as the sun rose higher and there was still no sign of anything, the reassurance began to crack. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. If they were just lost, there should have been something, a call, a footprint, a piece of cloth caught on them. Instead, there was only a prolonged silence. And it was in that silence that hope gradually shifted from a firm belief to a fragile self-assurance that everything would be all right, though no one knew exactly how. When the initial hours of searching yielded no results, the investigation began to shift to human memory. The deputy detectives returned to the fair, not to look for clues on the ground, but to look for clues in people's memories. And it was there that the story began to fall apart into many incongruous pieces. A woman selling food near the maintenance area claimed she saw the four brothers talking to two strange men. According to her, it wasn't a friendly conversation. Their voices were sometimes louder, their gestures stiff. She remembered Emily standing back, shoulders hunched, her eyes unfocused, but she couldn't clearly remember the faces of the other two men. She only remembered an uneasy feeling that made her pay more attention than usual. Another teenager recounted seeing a dark-colored van parked near the service road, lights off, engine running. He said he didn't think much of it at the time, just found it strange that it wasn't parked in a designated area. When asked further, details became vague. He wasn't sure of the color. He couldn't remember the license plate. He was tired and just wanted to go home. A game dismantler remembered Emily sooner than anyone else. He said the young woman walked quickly, head down, her expression completely different from before. He assumed it was just a personal matter, perhaps an argument with her boyfriend, so he didn't ask any further questions. He didn't see Daniel, Luke, or Ethan with her at the time. Each testimony contains a piece of truth, but when placed side by side, they don't form a complete picture. The timings don't match. The locations differ by dozens of meters. Emotions are remembered more vividly than details. The only thing that repeats in all the stories is a feeling of unease, something that made the fair night anything but ordinary. For the family, these testimonies brought both hope and fear. Hope because there were signs that their children hadn't disappeared on their own accord. Fear because if someone else was involved, then the disappearance was certainly not random. And at the heart of those fragmented memories, the image of Emily taking a small but distinct step back began to haunt all who tried to piece together that last night. In the early days, the names of the four brothers appeared constantly in the local news. Images of the fair were replayed, the forests were filmed from above, and search teams moved silently among the trees, so similar they were indistinguishable. Reporters repeated their ages, names, and disappearance dates, as if simply repeating them enough would reveal the answer. But then, days passed without anything new to say. The news reports grew shorter, time was cut short. Questions began to be replaced by assumptions. When there were no new images, the media turned to other stories. A highway accident, a local election. Life went on at its own pace, and the disappearance, which had once dominated attention, quietly slipped out of the spotlight. For the family, the feeling of being left behind is very real, not because they think the media owes them anything, but because every time the cameras leave, hope leaves with them. When no one asks about them anymore, no one mentions their children's names on the news every night, the worries become more private and heavier. The case doesn't disappear. It just stops being talked about. Within the investigation, the language also changed. Active searching became information tracking. Being alive gradually shifted to if found. Areas that had been searched were marked as complete, not because they were certain, but because there was no other option. Files grew thicker, but progress did not. As summer faded and the leaves began to change color, people stopped asking each other about the fair. Conversations avoided mentioning Harper's name, not because they had forgotten, but because mentioning it was too painful. The case went into a state of coldness, not with an official decision, but with the shared weariness of all those who had waited too long without receiving any answers. Nearly a year after the fair, when many had learned to live with the emptiness, a sudden call brought the town to a standstill. A man fishing along a stream a few miles from the fair said he'd found a backpack stuck among the rocks. It wasn't buried deep. It wasn't torn. It just lay there, as if someone had put it down and forgotten about it. The backpack was instantly recognizable. The color, the stitching, the familiar frayed edges. It was Ethan's. As the news spread, hope surged, painfully so. If the backpack was there, perhaps he was still alive. If the belongings were intact, perhaps they were still somewhere, waiting to be found. The family clung to that assumption like a lifeline in the cold water. The police returned to the stream. They waded upstream and downstream, examining every bank and every tree trunk. But the more they looked, the less the backpack belonged. The fabric hadn't faded as it should have after months in the water. Inside, several items were inexplicably dry. There was no sign that it had drifted naturally for such a long distance. Hope began to change shape, from longing to doubt. If the backpack hadn't drifted there on its own, then someone had brought it. And if someone intentionally let it be found, then the purpose wasn't to help. The discovery didn't bring them any closer to the truth. It only opened up another, deeper despair. That someone knew. That someone had remained silent. And that Ethan's disappearance, along with the others, was never an accident. 18 years is a long enough time for a child to grow into an adult, long enough for a town to change its appearance, and long enough for pain to fade from its sharp point, becoming a lingering, persistent ache that clings to every beat of life. For families, time doesn't heal. It only teaches them how to live with absence. Daniel's room remained virtually unchanged. His father dusted it, but never cleaned it. Every item was kept exactly as it was, as if even the slightest disturbance would leave Daniel with no way back. Luke didn't return home, but his clothes were still carefully folded, then unfolded, then folded again. His mother was never sure whether putting things away meant giving them up. Ethan had siblings growing up, while questions about him became less and less frequent, not because they forgot, but because they didn't know how to ask anymore. Family gatherings lacked a familiar voice, a laugh that used to make everything easier. That absence became an empty chair, always present, even though no one pointed to it. For Emily, the void took on a different form. Her phone number remained there for years. Every few months, her mother would call it, only to hear the youthful voice on voicemail. The voice promising to call back later. No one could bring themselves to delete it. Changing it would be like admitting Emily would never answer again. 18 years have passed without an answer. Only new habits of endurance. The family learned to live on, but not to let go. Hope is no longer an expectation, but a thin thread, enough to keep them standing, though no one knows when it will snap. In the summer of 2015, an old cabin atop the ridge was put on the demolition list. It had been abandoned for years, its wood rotting, its roof crumbling in sections, existing only as a small scratch on the land map. The workers weren't looking for anything other than cleaning. They lifted each floorboard, hoping to find rotting rubbish and rusty nails. What they found was intent. Beneath a collapsed section of floor, pressed between damp earth and broken wooden beams, lay objects not of decay, a length of rope, a few old tools, and a photograph folded in half, its edges frayed and soft with age. The photograph was torn almost in two, not by water or rats, but by a human hand. When unfolded, the light shone directly on four familiar faces, the fair in the background, hanging lights, smiles that hadn't yet faded. Daniel stood close to Luke. Ethan leaned forward. Emily was at the edge of the frame, catching just enough light. No explanation was needed. Everyone understood. The photograph was taken at the fair. It wasn't a random memento. It had been kept, hidden, placed under the floor like something forbidden from returning to the light. The back of the photograph bore a faint, very thin fingerprint, but enough to be noted. Enough to say that someone had touched that moment, then decided to bury it along with the secret. When the news arrived, the investigators approached the cabin with a different kind of caution. No longer assumptions, no longer faint hopes. The photograph anchored time, pulling the past back into the present. It said that the four people hadn't simply vanished. It said that someone had been there, had watched them smile, and had decided to keep half the story to themselves, believing the decaying floorboards would remain silent forever. But time wasn't on the side of secrets, and the floorboards, finally, gave way. Behind the cabin, through a strip of low, seemingly natural vegetation, the ground sloped down into a shallow ravine. Not deep, not rugged, just a small bend in the hillside where rainwater collected and drained. For years, no one paid attention to it. On old maps, this ravine was outside the search zones. It was too close to the cabin to be suspected, and too insignificant to be questioned. As the investigators expanded the survey area, they weren't searching intuitively. They were working with patience. Each plot of land was marked. Each layer of soil was carefully removed. And then, just below the surface, the first thing that emerged wasn't a clear answer, but a hesitation, a small bone fragment. Not enough to identify immediately, but enough to slow all movement. The days that followed unfolded in silence. No cheers, no hurried confirmations. Time had done its work. Everything was fragmented, separated, swept away by the rain, by wild animals, by gravity. But the way the bones lay together told a different story. This wasn't a place someone had accidentally fallen. This was where they had been brought. The DNA test results came back in pieces, like heavy heartbeats. Daniel, Luke, Ethan, Emily. 4 names were read aloud, not over a loudspeaker, not on a flyer, but in an official report. 18 years of waiting ended in a single, chilling moment. No one would call it relief. No one would call it peace. But the truth, however belated, remains the truth. The ravine behind the cabin, which had been overlooked for nearly 2 decades, finally returned what it had held. Not justice, not a complete answer, just proof that those 4 people were here. And that they were never forgotten, only hidden away. When the final pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place, another truth emerged, cold and irreversible. The man responsible for what had happened was no longer alive. He had died years earlier, taking with him all explanations, all possibilities of confrontation, and the trial that the family had silently awaited. There were no handcuffs, no courtroom, no moment of hearing one's name read aloud before the judge. According to the law, there was enough evidence to conclude the case, but not enough evidence to prosecute. Justice arrived, but too late to punish. It arrived just early enough to speak the truth. For the family, this news brought no sense of victory. No one felt relieved, knowing that the person who caused the pain was no longer alive. Anger had nowhere to be directed. Questions remained unanswered. 18 years of waiting had not earned them even a single word of acknowledgement. Investigators spoke cautiously about closing the case. They called it resolved, a word that sounded much neater than it actually was. Because in the hearts of those left behind, nothing was truly closed. There are losses that cannot be resolved by procedure. There are crimes that cannot be measured by a sentence. Justice, in this case, did not enter the courtroom. It stood only at the threshold, close enough to be seen, but never to be touched. And the only thing left for the families was not punishment, but the truth, naked, belated, and unchangeable. After all, the fair returns every summer. The lights are hung up again. Music resounds through the valley. Children still run along the old paths, unaware that this place once held a secret for too long. Life doesn't stop because of a tragedy. It simply learns to go around it, carrying memories as a part of the earth. Near the edge of the fair, where the light gradually faded, a small plaque was laid down. Simple. Just 4 names, 4 ages, and the years between their disappearance and their discovery. People paused in silence. Some knew them, others were hearing the story for the first time. But everyone understood that those names were no longer rumors, no longer questions. They had been called back to their rightful place. The truth, arriving late, brought no miracles. It didn't erase 18 years of waiting. It didn't bring back lost birthdays, empty-seated dinners, or unanswered calls. But the truth did something else. It rewrote the story. It said that those 4 people didn't simply disappear. They were taken away, and the evidence patiently waited to be seen. In this mountainous region, people believe that the earth remembers everything, that what is buried will not remain buried forever. This case ended not with the hammer of the court, but with an acknowledgement that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes, it is simply a place where the truth is waiting to be called out. And when the fairground lights dimmed each night, what remained wasn't fear, but memories. Memories of 4 people who had laughed under those lights. And a quiet reminder that some evidence doesn't disappear. It just waits long enough for it to be returned to its rightful place.